Introduction. Scientific interest in social and political questions is hardly less old than scientific interest in cosmology and physics, and there were periods in antiquity — I have Plato's political theory in mind and Aristotle's collection of constitutions — when the science of society might have seemed to have advanced further than the science of nature. But with Galileo and Newton, physics became successful beyond expectation, far surpassing all the other sciences. And since the time of Pasteur, the Galileo biology, the biological sciences have been almost equally successful. But the social sciences do not as yet seem to have found their Galileo. In these circumstances, students who work in one or another of the social sciences are greatly concerned with problems of method, and much of their discussion of these problems is conducted with an eye upon the methods of the more flourishing sciences, especially physics. It was, for instance, a conscious attempt to copy the experimental method of physics which led, in the generation of Wundt, to a reform in psychology, and since J.S. Mill, repeated attempts had been made to reform on somewhat similar lines the method of the social sciences. In the field of psychology, these reforms may have had some measure of success, despite a great many disappointments. But in the theoretical social sciences, outside economics, little else but disappointment has come from these attempts. When these failures were discussed, the question was soon raised whether the methods of physics were really applicable to the social sciences. Was it not perhaps the obstinate belief in their applicability that was responsible for the much deplored state of these studies? The query suggests a simple classification of the schools of thought interested in the methods of the less successful sciences. According to their views on the applicability of the methods of physics, we may classify these schools as pro-naturalistic or as anti-naturalistic, labeling them pro-naturalistic or positive if they favour the application of the methods of physics to the social sciences, and anti-naturalistic or negative if they oppose the use of these methods. Whether a student of method upholds anti-naturalistic or pro-naturalistic doctrines, or whether he adopts a theory combining both kinds of doctrines, will largely depend on his views about the character of the science under consideration and about the character of its subject matter. But the attitude he adopts will also depend on his views about the methods of physics. I believe this latter point to be the most important of all. And I think that the crucial mistakes in most methodological discussions arise from some very common misunderstandings of the methods of physics. In particular, I think they arise from a misinterpretation of the logical form of its theories, of the methods of testing them, and of the logical function of observation and experiment. My contention is that these misunderstandings have serious consequences, and I will try to justify this contention in chapters 3 and 4 of this study. There I will try to show that various and sometimes conflicting arguments and doctrines, anti-naturalistic as well as pro-naturalistic, are indeed based upon a misunderstanding of the methods of physics. In chapters 1 and 2, however, I will confine myself to the explanation of certain anti-naturalistic and pro-naturalistic doctrines that form part of a characteristic approach in which both kinds of doctrines are combined. This approach, which I propose first to explain and only later to criticize, I call Historicism. It is often encountered in discussions on the method of the social sciences, and it is often used without critical reflection, or even taken for granted. What I mean by historicism will be explained at length in this study. It will be enough if I say here that I mean by historicism an approach to the social sciences which assumes that historical prediction is their principal aim, and which assumes that this aim is attainable by discovering the rhythms or the patterns, the laws or the trends that underlie the evolution of history. Since I am convinced that such historicist doctrines of method are at bottom responsible for the unsatisfactory state of the theoretical social sciences, other than economic theory, my presentation of these doctrines is certainly not unbiased. But I have tried hard to make a case in favour of historicism in order to give point to my subsequent criticism. I have tried to present historicism as a well-considered and close-knit philosophy, and I have not hesitated to construct arguments in its support, which have never, to my knowledge, been brought forward by historicists themselves. I hope that, in this way, I have succeeded in building up a position really worth attacking. In other words, I have tried to perfect a theory which has often been put forward, but perhaps never in a fully developed form. This is why I have deliberately chosen the somewhat unfamiliar label Historicism. By introducing it, I hope I shall avoid merely verbal quibbles, for nobody, I hope, will be tempted to question whether any of the arguments here discussed really or properly or essentially belong to historicism, or what the word historicism really or properly or essentially means.